for joining us for the South Pacific's Passive House Conference. I'm Nick Bamford, Victorian Education Sector Lead at ACOM, and I'm joined today by Sian Wilmot, a Sustainability Practice Lead. We're presenting today the Passive House design for Monash Gillies Hall. Having worked on this project for a number of years now, and the building has been operational for a number of years, we're looking to share the process that we've undertaken to further analyse the building to consider the life cycle operation of the Passive House systems. Many of you may be familiar with the project and have seen us present on this before. For those who are less familiar with the project, we're looking to step back a little bit and present on how we approach the design, the brief, and how the building's been performing over the last couple of years. Monash commenced their journey on this project back in early 2017, and the brief included 150 bed single occupancy units, support staff residences, floor lounges for the occupants, communal spaces, and a large landscaped area around the building. The building itself was targeting Passive House, and this needed to be completed within an exceptionally tight 20-month period from the point that we were engaged around mid-2017 for building services and structures, through to end of construction and occupation. That's very tight, irrespective of the need to target Passive House. Though timber was not a core part of the brief, very early on we realised that it was one of the key means to be able to achieve that type program, and as well as that, minimise the impact of the surrounding buildings. Although there's a landscaped area, there's also existing residences immediately across the fence, lined to Monash's campus, and existing teaching and learning buildings adjacent as well. So this is all quite a hefty challenge, which was put to us to achieve in a very quick time frame. Passive House itself is not new. However, there is very limited examples of a Passive House building, particularly of this scale, in a warmer climate. And very early on we engaged to understand what the climate looked like in the area of this development, and then align that to existing projects that exist that have used Passive House around the world. And very quickly we realised that the combination of timber, Passive House and the warmer Australian climate meant that there was no engineering precedence whatsoever for a building of this type. It meant that very early on in the design process we needed to go right back to first principles and do conceptual modelling, really right from concept, to prove that the Passive House design was even valid for a building that targeted Passive House without any active conditioning systems, be it heating or cooling. We needed to develop confidence in ourselves, lest develop confidence in our client Monash that this was a building that could be built and would result in occupant comfort for the students. Now, for those on the call, you obviously understand the concept of Passive House and many of the design criteria that go together to form the Passive House criteria. And I won't go into those in detail. However, this building is a little different to many that have been presented at this conference. The Passive House design is obviously established around residential, and although this building is primarily residential in use, the building scale and a lot of the building systems closer align the design to that of a commercial building. And in fact, we pretty much had to start from scratch in developing the specifications and some of the design principles around more of a commercial style development, and it's one that now sees us to future-proof that design process for more educational and larger commercial style developments. So the areas where it had to change here were really around some of the systems. They had those heat recovery systems which are at a large building scale, and also things like the detailing around air tightness. For this particular building, given the internal connectivity, we couldn't do the air tightness testing in stages. In fact, we had to do the air tightness testing as the whole building. So the contractor Multiplex had to work very hard to ensure that the design principles were being adopted throughout the whole process to ensure the test was successful at the end. For us in the mechanical design, it meant that we had to consider all of the unique student residence demands in the space. So as an example, the fridge selection. So each of these residences have a fridge and a fully equipped kitchen. In fact, the fridges alone we found were sufficient to provide heating all year round for these little units for the students, and therefore created a overheating risk in summer. So we had to work with our client Monash to select the right fridge to ensure that we didn't overheat these small units. Now from there, we moved on to facade optimization. Given this is a large building, we needed to work very closely on the form factors of the building, so the facade to floor area ratios were in the right position to be able to achieve passive house. But then again, the facade shading strategy was the best scenario that we could achieve for Monash and for the building. And to be able to optimise for the various parameters involved, for instance, extent of glazing, the external shading, each of the different facade orientations and the insulation ratings, we adopted a computational modelling optimisation. So this actually optimised for all of those different parameters for each of the facade orientations to ensure that we had the best fit for thermal performance and the best fit for the occupant comfort, and also external connectivity, providing those sightlines which are so good down in that peninsula region. So the final design here, we can see some of the images, and we worked very closely with the architect JCB to ensure each of those facades was optimised. And the facade system itself involves 5 different profiled aluminium pieces, which are then used in different orientations and in different patterns around the facade, which gives it that high level of articulation. And the facade design itself then works together with the insulation and thermal bridging to ensure that we achieve those high-performing facade, high-performing thermal performance. Mechanical system design, and we went for a relatively conventional passive house design with heat recovery systems operating at 80% efficiency and no active heating and cooling. Now, we did consider these heat recovery systems being located in each individual space. However, given the impact that would have on occupants if these units broke down and needing to get into their spaces to be able to maintain them, as well as the additional facade penetrations, with 150 beds, that's quite a number of facade penetrations. We then pushed for having large central heat recovery systems. Now, as well as reducing facade penetrations, that meant that those systems could then aggregate thermal performance for the whole of the building. We could then focus on the building thermal performance as a whole, as any heat or any cool, in fact, is then shared and distributed evenly. Now, this is great in winter's mornings, say when we have eastern facade sun, then heating up that eastern facade, we can actually share that heat then around the whole of the building. So in fact, the western facade then gets that benefit. For this style of building and those like it, that has a significant benefit for any of the larger commercial style passive house buildings. So this central system is then modelled, and we can consider then the thermal performance against business as usual. So we can see here from the modelling process that passive house is going to perform amazingly consistently well, and the temperature profile we compared this in IES had a number of days very warm, so up to 40 degrees, and we're predicting that the spaces would achieve very consistent operation around 25 degrees, and certainly within the passive house criteria that needs to achieve no greater than 30 degrees on a percentage of days. Now, this informed us going with passive house, but also not having any thermal conditioning in the space. And the final design for each of the spaces is then very cut back. So air is supplied out into the bedrooms and then extracted back in from the bathrooms. That same system then has mechanical dampers in, which control the amount of air being distributed to the space. Low-level air is supplied into the spaces at all times, but in fact that system can operate as a boost when the bathroom is in operation, or in fact when the whole of the building is trying to purge heat. Now, for those warmer days, we certainly envisage the space would achieve for a few hours in the year upward of 30 degrees, and to ensure comfort for those temperatures, each space then has a ceiling fan. And if we consider the air velocity as a function of temperature, the analysis suggests for passive house we do have almost all hours within that comfort zone for the occupants, which is really great news and a testament to the design. As compared to business as usual, particularly in winter, we see the temperatures dropping right down, and hence for those business as usual constructions, heating is still required, which we don't see here. So, how's the building performed? Now, back when it opened in early 2019, it opened in around February, and it was just before the weather started getting really warm. And I mean really warm. We had a heat wave even, I would say, in the first couple of weeks of it opening up, and certainly put the building through its paces and had us literally sweating around how the students were going in the building. And we can see here some of the early BMS results, which surprised everyone. We had external temperatures up to 43 degrees for a number of days, both before the BMS started recording data, and then again when the building was occupied. And even after these consecutive hot days, the internal temperature peaked at around 32 degrees, which was pretty consistent with how we expected the building to perform, which is great news for the building and the occupants. Amazingly, the occupants were very tolerant in the warm weather, and in fact enjoyed the warm weather thoroughly, most of which coming from international students or warmer parts of Australia. And certainly after the first week of very warm weather, the building then started to come into its own. We see here the performance then over the first month or two, very consistent around the 25 to 30 degree level, which has been great, and which is amazing to see without any active heating or cooling systems. The control of the whole of the building temperature thermal performance has been on the basis of deciding when we relieve heat through the heat exchangers, or when we capture that heat to then, or capture the coolant in fact, to hold the temperatures in the building. And this continued for the rest of the season as well. We can see here going through from summer then into winter, and overall the performance has been exceptional, and the users have been really happy with it. The lower temperatures there on the late winter were actually as a result of the student holidays. So we had about 60% of the building in occupation, and given the building ventilation systems circulate air throughout the whole of the building, we actually found that 60% of occupation wasn't enough to be able to keep temperatures within that 20 degree band, which was an interesting result, and meant that through building tuning we've further improved building operation by closing down ventilation to those spaces that are occupied for longer than 24 hours, which has been great, and has since improved temperatures again in winter. So this first 6 months of operation has been amazingly consistent in showing worst case summer and worst case winter. We've continued to track this through the rest of the year, and then again for the first 6 months of this year, and our temperatures have continued along this trajectory. So very consistent between the 20 and 25 degree mark for those users. Now, comparing this back to the model data, and this is where we're really happy with the result. We did a lot of work on this modelling to prove that this building would operate, and in fact, when we compare it to actual BMS data, it's amazingly consistent. If the difference is there, then that difference is primarily due to the differences in weather files, which we can see here in green. So the actual BMS data based on actual weather was had a significantly hotter days in summer, and then again in winter we had that lower occupancy, which wasn't taken into account in the modelling. So overall, a really good result for how the building has been performing in response to both summer and winter.
As Nick mentioned, we've continued to collaborate on Gillies Hall with Monash University, the client, post-construction. And this year, with our costing team, we were able to complete a life cycle costing exercise, comparing it to a typical university student housing development. Where Gillies Hall was provided with absolutely no active conditioning, the traditional student hall was provided with radiant heaters to each student room, which is pretty common here in Melbourne, and they were supplied with hot water via gas-fired boilers. Neither Gillies Hall or the typical housing was provided with cooling. Now, this was purely a direct financial comparison, so it didn't include costs like predicted carbon taxes, social costs, or similar. The results of the analysis actually demonstrated that on a gross floor area comparison, Gillies Hall had an improved net present value over 30 years. And although the facade costs for Gillies Hall were higher, significantly higher, at approximately 30% based on GFA, this investment actually allowed for the reduction of mechanical services such as active heating and cooling. Now, there may also be other factors, that contribute to the higher facade costs, such as the beautiful architectural expressions here at Gillies Hall, some of which do not actually contribute to the overall passive house outcome. However, those differences were not considered as part of the analysis. So as we understand, the potential cost savings could have been actually higher. The electricity usage and thus operational electricity cost is actually greater for Gillies Hall, and this is due to the constant running of fans to provide outside air to students through the heat recovery ventilation systems. Although a large energy use, this consumption provides the students with both thermal comfort and high levels of fresh air, significantly improving their indoor environment quality and also making it a really nice place to live. Overall operating costs were, however, higher for the typical student housing building, and this was due to the gas required to provide hot water to the radiators in the student rooms, something that was not present on Gillies Hall. Despite the usage rates for gas being the equivalent of 4 times cheaper than electricity here in Melbourne, the daily connection charge is actually more than twice that of the daily connection charge for electricity. And this means that the typical student housing was paying for a daily connection charge rate for both gas and electricity, which was nearly 3.5 times the amount Gillies Hall was paying for an electricity connection only. The passive house design philosophy also meant that Gillies Hall could be an economical electric-only building, which is not something we typically see here in Melbourne. It also means that Gillies Hall is currently carbon neutral ready. Now, the typical student housing would require a solid transition plan to meet the same targets. And a transition to 100% electricity for a typical student housing building would require the replacement of both the domestic hot water and heating hot water boilers, which would necessitate both a capital and a spatial investment, particularly given the same capacity heat pumps currently require approximately 5 times the space that the typical gas boiler would in a highly ventilated area. So the final results demonstrated that over a 30-year period, Monash Gillies provides a 3.5% improvement over a typical student housing development, as well as providing a high indoor environment quality, including improved thermal and acoustic comfort, as well as indoor air quality. Gillies Hall was also the first large-scale development in Australia to ascertain passive house certification, which generally means that a premium for both materials and construction was paid. The passive house design methodology, however, is happily becoming much more popular in the Australian climate, which should hopefully result in cost premiums diminishing over time.
Takeaways from today's presentation. Most of you will be well aware of the potential of passive house in the Australian climate, and it has been an honour to be able to demonstrate this through Gillies Hall. But in addition to this, and through the work of our team, we've shown that as well as delivering a highly sustainable and comfortable building, passive house can reduce the total cost of ownership as compared to conventional building construction. Through this and the efforts of Monash University, we hope to see passive house become a key feature of the future sustainable buildings. Thank you again for joining us today, and reach out if you wish to discuss further.